In 2001, two rival groups of high school nerds became the biggest drug smugglers in the United States. For years, they slipped past the FBI, the DEA, and the Border Patrol, moving over 17,000 pounds of weed and making $32 million. But jealousy, betrayal, and shady deals tore their empire apart. This is the true story of teenage geeks who turned into drug lords. 19-year-old high school graduate Nate Norman worked as a pizza delivery guy at Pizza Hut. He lived in his mom's basement in Idaho. His closest brush with organized crime had been watching Scarface on cable. But one day, everything changed. Hanging out with his buddy Topher, smoking a joint, Nate flipped through a copy of High Times A magazine all about weed. He stumbled on a story that would change their lives. In 2001, Canada legalized medical marijuana, and the best bud came out of British Columbia. Idaho was just a few hours from the Canadian border. Nate realized the world's best weed was practically within reach, and he could sell it for a fortune. "We should become international drug smugglers," he told Topher. There was only one problem: money. Pizza Hut didn't pay much, and Topher made peanuts working at a theme park. Still, he believed in his friend. He sold an old boat he'd once dragged up from the bottom of a lake for $1,400, the exact price of a pound of weed. They headed north. After hours of searching for a dealer, they ended up in a Canadian bar. Nate spotted an old man named Frankie and straight up asked him where they could score a pound. Frankie said he had plenty of the best Canadian bud back at his place and agreed to sell them a pound for $1,400. But when Nate tried to check the bag, Frankie warned them it wasn't smart if the smell gave them away at the border. They'd be busted. So the boys handed over all their cash without ever weighing or smelling the goods. With their prize in hand, they turned to the hard part, getting it across the border. Canada's border is 3 times longer than Mexico's, but there were no fences, just woods you walked through until you were in the U.S. Nate drove back in the car while Topher stuffed the weed into his backpack. He had 2 jobs: hike 11 kilometers through the wilderness and avoid running into a grizzly. After hours of trekking, he finally saw signs of Civilization A steakhouse where Nate was waiting out front. It looked like the plan had worked. But after the first hit, they realized something was wrong. Frankie had ripped them off. He sold them cheap Mexican weed at British Columbia prices. Those buds had already been smuggled twice, first from Mexico into the U.S., then into Canada before the boys smuggled them right back into the States. Nate and Topher learned fast. In this game, you couldn't trust anyone, not even harmless-looking old men. Luckily, there were plenty of people eager to smoke. Nate called up his old friend Skuz, a street-smart kid who could move anything. At 18, Skuz sold the whole stash for $2,800, double what they'd paid. Nate had proved his business model worked. High Times was right. "Why isn't everyone doing this?" he told Topher. According to Nate's math, they could make $3 million in just 14 months, doubling their money on every run. For them, that was enough after all. $3 million in your pocket made delivering pizzas way more fun than doing it broke. They dreamed of buying a house, starting a legit business, and getting out before greed took them down. Because in drug dealing, people only get caught when they get too greedy. But that promise, no guns, no girls, no flashy spending, wasn't really about them. On the way to Creston, Nate thought hard about his future. This business could be his golden ticket, and college no longer seemed necessary. After just a few successful runs, he could buy his mom a car. Then, in his rearview mirror, flashing red and blue lights appeared. The Canadian police pulled him over. Each step the officer took felt like a death sentence to Nate, but instead of an arrest, the cop simply said, "So, you boys smuggling? You won't find anything in Creston. Head to Nelson instead. Just don't speed. I'll give you a warning." Nate was stunned. Not only was he free to go, he'd also just been handed a clue to where the real British Columbia bud could be found. Canada was nothing like the U.S. In the early 2000s, the weed industry there brought in $7 billion a year, and Nelson was its capital. With some of the most lenient laws in the world and medical marijuana legalized, it was the golden age of BC bud. After checking out a few hydroponic shops, Nate finally found real growers willing to supply him for runs into the U.S. The system was simple. At night, about a mile from the border, Topher, dressed in camouflage, would jump out of the car with a bag of cash and disappear into the woods. After hiking more than 7 miles, he'd swap the money for a bag of weed and retrace his steps. Nate crossed the border by car while Topher hiked back on foot. Once reunited, they'd hand the stash off to Skuz, who distributed it to hundreds of dealers. Topher pocketed $1,000 per run, while Nate kept over $150,000, more money than he'd ever seen in his life. The business was booming and the company needed to grow. They brought in friends from high school, and soon the whole nerd gang was trekking across the border with bags stuffed with as much as $400,000 in cash. Just a year earlier, they'd sworn not to flaunt their money. But soon everyone started buying their dream toys, motorcycles, jet skis, plasma TVs, even mini-disc players, always the top-of-the-line models. Skuz moved out of his mom's basement, claiming he was renting a tiny apartment, but in reality, he'd bought a house on the lake. Nate began throwing massive parties every week, inviting half the town. He bought a mansion with 8 bedrooms, a separate house just to stash cash, 20-inch rims for his cars, and diamond chains. In his mind, real drug dealers were like rappers, with watches, recording studios, and expensive bling. He even got himself a girlfriend, a stripper named Buffy. When Nate's mom asked him where all the money was coming from, he told her it was from his snow-plowing business. Then he bought her a house in Lakeside, and she never asked again. The scariest part of the story is that he never told her the truth. Nate had worked as a paperboy, a telemarketer, a cashier, and a pizza delivery kid, but he realized one thing: the only get-rich-quick scheme that really worked was selling weed. A year later, the crew had grown to 32 people. They were moving 1,000 pounds across the country. What started as a simple hustle had turned into a well-oiled machine. But problems still happened. One night, the runners stumbled across a DEA agent asleep in his truck in the middle of the woods. Another time, in -14-degree weather, they lost the trail and nearly froze to death. Nate began rigging cars with explosives. If the cops ever pulled them over, they could blow the vehicle and escape. It was already 2002. To calm his runners, who were hauling 1,000 pounds and risking federal time, Nate promised that if they ever got busted, he'd pay their bail and hire lawyers. But Topher was getting nervous. He didn't like how flashy Nate's lifestyle was becoming or how fast the business was growing. He begged Nate to quit. Nate just joked that he'd stop only if the cops caught him, because you can always pay the best lawyers. Their original goal of $3 million was laughable now. They made that in a single month. To shut Topher up, Nate bumped his pay to $88,000 per run. Then, one night, Nate got a call. Skuz had been robbed. 3 masked men stormed his house, held him at gunpoint, and demanded to know where the cash and the weed were. Clearly, someone had betrayed them. The thieves knew not just about the operation, but about their addresses too. Nate wasn't the only teenager running weed across the border. A kid nicknamed Vank had been born in Korea, adopted, and raised in comfort. He played violin, got straight A's, and lived the perfect student life. But at 17, he cracked, downing OxyContin, snorting coke, driving a Cadillac Eldorado, and running his own smuggling ring. Vank was a lot like Nate, a nerd who turned into a teenage drug lord, but also his complete opposite. It wasn't enough for him to make millions with friends. He wanted the whole market. Nate knew about Vank and the other dealers in town, but figured there was enough money for everyone. Vank wanted his cut by force. He called up his old roommate Giovanni and offered him $100,000 to take out Nate Norman, fronting him $5,000. Giovanni, a kid who'd never committed a crime in his life, surprisingly said, "Why not?" He rallied a few friends and bought everything they'd need: a tarp, gloves, rope. Meanwhile, Vank threw a huge party, making sure plenty of people could vouch that he wasn't out killing anyone that night. But instead of pulling off the hit, Giovanni and his buddies broke into Skuz's place, stealing a few pounds of weed and $40,000 in cash. Since Giovanni still hadn't received his $5,000 down payment, he figured he might as well score some quick money another way. He had no idea he'd just dragged himself into a turf war with another teenage kingpin. For the first time, Nate was truly scared. He moved out of his house, rented a place across town, and started sleeping with a loaded gun under his pillow. For the rest of the summer, he tried to keep a low profile and eventually moved in with his girlfriend Buffy. But after a crash that left him with both arms broken, Nate developed a serious addiction to painkillers. Buffy, fresh out of breast implant surgery, could barely take care of him. So Nate lived in fear, hooked on pills, stuck with a girl who had nothing to offer but oversized boobs. On November 13, 2002, a logger in the mountains found the body of a dead boy. At first, police assumed he was just a violin player and an honor student. But digging deeper, they discovered that under the name Vink, he'd been living a double life, a major dealer moving weed all across America. Nate's main rival in the business was Vink. Nate had gone from a pizza delivery kid living in his mom's basement to the king of a smuggling empire that even the cartels envied. Some of his dealers got busted by cops who found cash, drugs, and guns. From jail, they made their one phone call. "Tell Nate I'm locked up." That was all it took for the DA, FBI, and Homeland Security to confirm that Nate Norman was the one running the entire operation. As for Vink, Brandon Butler, he never realized his own hired killer would turn on him. So strung out, he'd been holding back Giovanni's $5,000 advance for months. One day, he drove Giovanni into the woods, the very place he planned to bury Nate's body after the hit. Giovanni once again asked about the down payment, but Vink brushed it off. "Don't worry about it, man," Giovanni snapped. He wrapped his hands around Vink's neck and squeezed until he stopped breathing. To cover his tracks, he slit Vink's throat, took his money, and left the body right where Nate was supposed to end up. That was the moment Nate knew it was time to get out. Within his crew, many suspected he'd had something to do with Vink's death. At dawn, the runners gathered in a secluded spot, ready to pack up and leave town. But instead of fleeing, they sat around smoking weed, reminiscing about the good times. And that's when the FBI swooped in, arresting runners, managers, and dealers, everyone except Nate Norman. The feds grilled them one by one, pulling every detail of Nate's operation. But when Nate found out they were threatening his crew with long sentences and turning them against each other, he walked into the police station and turned himself in. The cops couldn't believe their eyes. They expected a hardened criminal mastermind, and instead they got a kid who'd only just finished high school. According to federal estimates, about 2,500 pounds had been smuggled. In reality, the crew had moved over 17,000 pounds of weed, raking in $32 million, all before they were out of their teens. "I think these kids embarrass the United States government," one agent said. Giovanni was sentenced to life for the murder of Brandon Butler. Skuz and Topher each got 2 years. Nate Norman was sentenced to 12. He walked free on December 10, 2013, and now runs a legitimate HVAC business. By all accounts, life has turned out well for him. Topher Clark was killed in a shootout in February 2019. That's how it goes. One day you're a nerd, the next you're a drug lord. Don't forget to subscribe for more crazy true crime stories.